Hey guys, I wanted to do a quick review of the flash carts from BitBuilt. These are single flash carts for the Game Boy and Game Boy Color. And this is not something like an EverDrive. It's not a ROM cart that you would just load a ton of different ROMs on and select it. This is more along the lines of people who want to develop their own games and want to send out single cartridges to people, or if they just want to sell individual versions. And there's 4 different types available. There's the 1 meg and 2 meg, and then there's the kind with the FRAM, and then also a real-time clock. So if you want to do your own hack of Pokemon or something with an actual real-time clock in it, this is what you would use. So I think they're pretty neat, and I think they definitely, especially considering the price, they have a great use for them. So I just want to show how they work and different scenarios and how you'd use them. So you'll want to start out by going to gameboy.bitbuilt.net, and then they have a page here that describes everything that you would need to know, and at the very bottom of the page is a link to download. The link is right here, and I'm not going to show the installation process because it's just a generic Windows installation. But after that's downloaded and installed, just load up the Cart Flasher software, and then you'll want to plug this into a USB 2 port. Some USB 3 ports have issues, not all, but it's best just to be safe. I'm going to start out by backing up one of my favorite games of all time, Metroid 2 Return of Samus. So once it's in, you're going to want to make sure the port is set to USB, obviously, and then hit the Cart Info button. And this will tell you everything that you need to back up the game. So it'll tell you the game title, but it'll also tell you cartridge type, MBC1, and I think it's safe to leave it on auto, but I always like to be sure. Then it shows you the ROM size, which is the size of the actual game, 256K. So we're going to set that to 6 for the flash. And then the RAM size, that's the save game, that's 8K. So I'm going to start out by saving the flash, which is the actual cartridge itself. And I'm also going to speed this up because I think it would just take a little bit too long to wait. M2. Okay, so now that that's done, I want to read the RAM, which is the actual save game as well. I'm also going to call that M2. Okay, there you go. Now next, you want to actually just insert whichever of the BitBuilt cards that you want to put in. I'm just going to choose this one, just top one off the pile. And the first thing you want to do is erase the RAM, and then erase the flash, and this will completely erase the contents of the actual cartridge itself. Okay, now that it's completely formatted, you want to just go back and write both the game and the actual flash to it. So I'm going to start out by writing the Metroid 2 game, and once again I'm going to speed this up a little bit just because it'll take a while. Okay, so next then I'm just going to write the actual RAM file. So this is the save game file that we just backed up. And no, that wasn't sped up. It really is that fast. So we should have it all on here now. I'll test with an AGS 101 just because it's very easy to see. And there you go. You could see that it actually starts from the save game point. Because any Metroid fan knows that if the save game didn't work, it would start directly from underneath the main ship. So just to show that, and we will just erase RAM. Now the save game file is gone. We'll put it back in. There you go, back at the ship. Another good thing too, if you're really just doing this to back up your save games, you could test using an emulator. So I'm going to make a copy of this just because I'm a freak and I like to make a copy of everything. And I'm going to rename it to .sa1, which is the format that Visual Boy Advance uses. So let me just open up this emulator here. That's loading. And as you could see, it loaded the main spot right where we just brought it back from. So overall, I like them. You know, it's not something everybody would use, but I think anybody, at the very least, anybody who's a fan of Game Boy and plays on the original cartridges would definitely want to back up the saves from their original carts. I like to do that as well, and I know it's a little weird because it's rare that I will go back and replay a game or try to go back and get more stuff, but I just feel like after spending, you know, hours and hours working your butt off playing a game, it's nice to know that your save game could be backed up. And there's also a lot of people that like to dump their own carts. They even play on ROM carts, but they just like to dump their own. I'm not sure if it's, you know, if it's sentimental reasons or if they're afraid that they got a bad dump of a current ROM. But either way, this thing is very cheap. And if you're a Game Boy fan, you should probably just pick one up. As for the carts themselves, no disrespect towards BitBuilt, but I'm not a developer. I'm just a player. So I think that most likely I'll stick with my EverDrives. I might buy one of the RealTime Clock versions of these just in case I ever want to mess with a game or just really do something separate. But I think these are perfect for developers, not just gamers. Especially because if you make your own game and you want to send a copy to somebody to review or look at, you know, it's so much cooler to actually have something to send them instead of just emailing them a ROM. And while there's nothing wrong with that at all, it's just, I don't know, it's pretty cool. I know that if I took the time to make my own game, I would love to be able to just put it in a box and mail it to somebody and say, you know, here, plug it into your Game Boy and play it. So overall, I definitely recommend them both, but I'd really like to hear from the person behind these products, Noah. So stay tuned for a short interview with Noah to talk about these products and BitBuilt. Hey guys, I'm here with Noah from BitBuilt. Would you mind talking about your Game Boy stuff for a while? Because I like it. You got the programmer, and I just grabbed one of the carts. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the programmer seems pretty straightforward. You use it to both read the ROMs and the save files from existing Game Boy games, and then you use it to write to your carts, correct?
Correct. So the programmer is based off of some old technology from the early 2000s. Probably anybody who's looked into doing their own kind of Game Boy stuff has run across the site. I believe the guy is German who hosted the site, so I'm not even going to attempt to say his name.
But it's like pronunciations too, yeah.
Yeah, it's like a rainbow background page, looks straight out of the late 90s, early 2000s. And so he has a whole host of information on custom carts. You know, most people for the longest time were just taking the AMD flash chips and throwing them into stock carts and just wiring up individually, which you can do, but it's quite messy if you don't have small gauge wire and are proficient with soldering. Mm-hmm. Or, you know, people have started cropping up where they were doing their own boards, which is exactly what that is right there. It's a custom board that is basically a one-to-one clone of the original Game Boy cart, with the exception of new flash memory on board. And with the standard ones, so the FRAM or the SRAM boards, not the RTC, there is one change. There's a little resistor that actually you have to jump. There's like a right enable pin on the FRAM that you have to pull high in order to get it to work with the Game Boy. But aside from that, I mean, everything's a one-to-one clone. You could throw, you know, Pokemon Red or Blue or Gold, Silver, Crystal on there and plug it into your transfer pack on the N64, and it wouldn't know the difference between that and an actual cartridge.
That's very cool. So could you explain about the different kinds and like the different models available? And I'll actually pull this out for anybody that wants to see. I'll try to keep this in focus here. But
sure.
So this board yourself, all of the boards on the inside of these are all custom built from scratch?
Yeah, that's correct.
And even the chips on them are brand new, newly sourced, right?
With the exception of the two chips on the top, the one you see there is the memory bank controller, and well, you don't have it there because it's the FRAM board, but that would be the lithium regulator, which kind of works with the SRAM to keep your save on there.
Okay.
So those two are the only ones that I have to pull from Game Boy boards because I didn't make a custom memory bank controller, which people have done in the past. So it's probably a cheaper process than actually making your own, because you'd have to buy, you know, a small FPGA, for example, and you'd have to write all the code and put that on there. And depending on the one you use, the price could be as much as a Game Boy cartridge itself. Right. So, and then you also, if you do a battery model, you need to source the the lithium chip as well, which again could be another $1-2. So you're just racking up the cost there. It's something that I'd like to do in the future, but I'm not sure. So back to the different models, we've got the 1 MB model, which will work with a lot of games. Some of the later heavier titles, like actually I don't even think the Zeldas. So the ones I know of off the top of my head are the 3 later Pokemon games that work on the Game Boy Color. So Gold, Silver, Crystal. Those are all 2 MB games. And I really can't think of another one off the top of my head. Most games are either 1 MB or some are even 512K, which, there are some Game Boy Color titles that are 512K. So that'll probably be suitable for most people. But for those who need the 2 MB, we've got a standard 2 MB model with a save battery, or we've got the 2 MB FRAM.
Well, hold on, just slow down for a minute here. I'm trying to keep up.
Yeah, sure.
So the 1 MB cart, do those come with the batteries built in?
Yes, they all ship with fresh batteries, charged up to 3.3 volts, like the day you pull them out of the package. They will also come with 256K of SRAM, so you should be able to fit any size save on there, with the exception of LSDJ. You're not going to be able to do all the songs that you want on there. It will work, and you can save, I think, a song, but you're not going to be able to do multiple on there.
Gotcha. So if somebody just wants a one-off flash card, just a cheap one, just to kind of mess with stuff, that one's fairly cheap as well, right?
Yeah, so that one's $20, and then you'll need a programmer. But I find that most people who are in this community, the Game Boy community, actually already have one, because there are a couple other programmers that are built off of the same open source technology out there. One that comes to mind is a guy on Tindy named Jay Rodrigo sells one, and I found that a lot of people have it just for things like backing up saves and keeping those and reflashing their saves. So, I mean, if you've already got one, then yeah, it's only $20.
Gotcha. So then to move on to the next one, that's the 2 meg cart, which is identical in every way except twice the size.
Correct. And there are 2 separate models with the 2 MB. There's one with a battery and there's one without. The one without uses FRAM, which I know people have tried in the past to replace their games. They've tried to replace the SRAM in their games with FRAM. It's worked to some extent. It only works with games that don't have a real-time clock. So any other game, you should be set. The thing about the real-time clock boards and FRAM that they don't mix well is because you need a battery to keep the time going.
Gotcha.
So I opted out from doing an FRAM real-time clock board. I mean, it's possible, but the frequency of you having to change your battery is going to be probably once every 4 or 5 years, depending on how much you really hardcore play it. So, I mean, it's not really worth it, especially because the FRAM is so much more expensive than the SRAM. I think it's like $3, $4, $5 price difference between the 2 models.
Wow. Could you explain the difference between FRAM and SRAM for people like me that want a refresher, or for people that have never heard of it before?
Sure. So SRAM actually requires a battery to keep the save. It's kind of like computer RAM, where if you power it off, it loses all of its contents. So
and that's the standard type of RAM that's been used in cartridges since, I think, the first Zelda was the first one to do that, correct?
Yeah, it's been used. It was used all the way up to Game Boy Advance games. Those are when they started to go to, FRAM in their cartridges.
Gotcha. And what is FRAM then?
So FRAM is ferroelectric RAM. It doesn't require any kind of electrical charge to be present constantly to keep its contents. Once you write it, if it loses a charge, like if it loses voltage going to the pins, it'll keep its memory in lock. It's not going to dump its contents and immediately have to be rewritten the next time you turn on your Game Boy. So if you're
kind of like an SD card.
Right. That's basically what it is. It's an SD card with a different format. It uses a different interface to talk, than an SD card would. But that being said, it's essentially a one-to-one clone, with the exception of you don't need the voltage to be constant on the RAM. So it's ideal for situations like this, or Super Nintendo games that have batteries. You could replace it with FRAM if you found the right model.
That's pretty awesome. So the fourth cart then, so you have the 1 meg, the 2 meg with SRAM, the 2 meg with FRAM, and then what is the final one?
So the last model that we've got available is a RealTime Clock cart. it's not something that the everyday person is going to use. It's more for the person who wants to have the ability to play Pokemon games stock without any patches or anything like that. You can throw it right on there, or any other game that actually uses the real-time clock. Those would all work 100% on there, because the other three carts are based on the Memory Bank Controller 5, and the real-time clock carts are based on the Memory Bank Controller 3. So I haven't even tested like compatibility all the way up, and it's explicitly said on the page, because I can't test every single Game Boy game that was developed after the MBC3 to test and see if it'll work. But that being said, it's designed to work with these specific games, and people seem to. What I've seen more of people buying them is them using them for Pokemon Crystal ROM hacks. There's a disassembly of the game on a GitHub somewhere where you can download it and you can edit the game to your pleasure and then recompile it, and it spits out a ROM. So then you can flash your ROM hack and it'll work just like the original cart would with your edits on board.
Gotcha. Very cool. So overall, I mean, I said it in the review. I think, I'm definitely buying the programmer off of you. I don't know why I haven't owned one before this. I think it's, for the price that you guys are selling these for, any Game Boy fan should just buy one if they don't have one already. I mean, at worst, it's great to back up all your saves, and that's still a pretty big compliment. But at best, you could use this thing, dump your own games for people that want to make sure they have a perfect copy, or if you want to do any of the flashing itself. But this is a very cool tool. But didn't mean to rhyme that one. But who do you find is predominantly buying the single flash carts? I imagine the cheapest one would be for people that just want to mess around with ROMs here and there, but don't want to invest in full ROM carts. But I would guess that developers would be the ones that were probably the most, purchasing the most. Am I wrong in that?
No, you're absolutely right. What I've seen is people who are either putting on their own games, or it's predominantly people who are doing hacks or edits of other games. They're putting it on there, using it to test, because with these cartridges, it's different than an EverDrive or Ben Van's El Cheapo, because it's a one-to-one clone. The Game Boy is not going to see any difference because there is no difference. It's stock Game Boy hardware with a different flash chip inside, which doesn't make any difference. So if you want to ensure 100% compatibility on original hardware, that's going to be the way to do it, because you're not going through any of the passes or the small edits that the other carts will use, such as the EverDrive, like I mentioned. It's just stock one-to-one original hardware is what the Game Boy sees it as.
Gotcha. Cool. So I think that pretty much sums it up for the Game Boy stuff, right?
Yeah.
I didn't miss anything? I'm always afraid I forgot something.
Basically went over everything.
Cool. So how did you get started in all this then? Do you do this for a day job, or are you just a nerd like me that loves this stuff?
Yeah, so I actually started, the Game Boy stuff came a little bit later, but I actually did start in the portabilizing community back in late 2010. So I've been doing this stuff for the better half of 7 years now. The Game Boy stuff I didn't really start getting into until after I had started BitBuilt. And, once I did that, I was blown away. I had no idea that people were taking SP screens and sticking them in AGBs, stuff like that, and all the custom front lights and back lights that I've seen. I didn't know any of that was going on. So when I found it, I was blown away. And then to find out that people are making, cartridges like this and all these flash carts and things like that, that just blew my mind. And I knew I wanted to jump into the community over there. So that's really when I started to look into doing this. And actually, funnily enough, one of the only reasons that I did the Game Boy carts in the first place was because I have a collection of all the original Pokemon games, including the Japanese ones. And I was looking and I was like, well, that kind of sucks. There's not an English green version. So I wanted to make a cartridge for the English green version. And as I went farther and farther into it, I was like, you could really make this something that, people would use. And so once I started to do that, went further and further down the rabbit hole, found the 2 meg flash, found that I could do it with RealTime Clock, and then the FRAM came after that. And so, eventually I had built up to the point where I had these, 4 separate carts that I had finished and I knew were working, and that's, how I got to that point.
That I have another question for you, but that reminds me about something we kind of glossed over before. So these carts that you sell, the actual carts themselves are real, like the plastic is real Game Boy carts, and then you take the guts out, you take the chips that you need and put them onto your own PCBs, right?
Hmm.
So how do you source the carts? Do you just go to stores and go to bargain bins and pull all the dollar ones out?
Yeah, it's either that or I mean there are like big retailers on eBay who have, tons and tons of Game Boy games that people don't want. Like for example, the real-time clock board, I use the Mary Kate and Ashley Pocket Planner, which I mean you can find for like $2 because nobody wants it in their collection. If you've got one, that's good enough. I mean you can find new in box copies for like $10 because nobody wants them. And then for the other ones it's usually a sports game or something like that are just thrown out or people just don't want. It's a good way to give them new life, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'll be honest. Normally, I don't really like doing stuff like this because there's a finite amount of these things. But every single retro game store I've ever been to, they have the good games on display, and then they have these huge bins filled with they're usually like a $1 pile, and you could go searching through, and these things are eventually they have been thrown out a lot, and they will eventually be thrown out. So this is one of the few cases that I mean, this is opinion, of course, so everybody's entitled to their own, but I genuinely think that this is a better use than the original. Because you have these things that you can get in a junk pile that might very well be thrown out at one point. Because, like you said, who's really going to sit there and play, a beat-up used copy of the Mary Kate and Ashley Planner game,
Right.
So to be able to actually use them for things and have them be reused over and over is pretty cool. Not to mention the whole cost thing, right? I mean, that cheap one, for you to sell that for $20, if you were to make your own case for it, it would either be a cheap printed 3D case or you'd need 20 grand in tooling, 15 grand in tooling to make it come out like that. So you'd
Right.
literally need to sell to get it back down to $20. You'd have to sell about 20,000 of them. So it's just not
Yeah.
feasible.
And then it begs the question, do you use the standard gray cart? Do you use a black one? Do you use the Game Boy Color cartridge? What do you do? And then it also doesn't have that authentic Nintendo feel because you're not going to get a one-to-one casting from what there was back in the day.
Mhm.
You see that all the time with the third-party injection molded cases for, reshelled handheld consoles or controllers or whatever it is. And then you can't stick the Nintendo logo on there either, so you're going to miss out on that. So do I really want to look like one of those Chinese sellers who has game on the top of their cartridges?
Right, yeah. It's certainly not a good feel. And I know if I took the time to develop a game, which I'm not smart enough to do, but assuming I was, I would want to present it like this. I would want to present it in a way where it looked and felt legit, like it was a real developed thing.
Right, yeah.
Well, exciting stuff. Thanks, man. And thanks for taking the time to do this. I know we've been bouncing back and forth, but I'm glad we finally got you on. And, I hope that more people are now aware of the BitBuilt stuff. And at the very least, pick up whatever products is relevant to them because it's good stuff.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on.
No problem. All right, man. Take care, and I'll see everybody next week.